In the year 2000, this company had more than 9,000 stores, tens of millions of members, and a name so famous it had become a verb. On a quiet afternoon that same year, a small, struggling startup walked into its headquarters in Dallas and offered to sell itself the whole company for $50 million. The startup was called Netflix, and according to the man who made that offer, Blockbuster's executives laughed them out of the room. 10 years later, Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy. The startup they laughed at is now worth more than 1,000 times what it once cost. Today, only a single Blockbuster store is left on the entire planet. So how does a $5 billion empire, with a store on nearly every corner in America, manage to kill itself in a single decade? What did they see in that room, and what did they miss? Today, we put Blockbuster on the table, because what killed it wasn't bad luck, and it wasn't just the internet. It was a series of decisions, each one reasonable, each one fatal. Let's begin the autopsy. To understand how big the fall was, you first have to understand how high Blockbuster stood. And in the 1990s, almost nobody stood higher. It started in 1985, in Dallas, Texas, with a single store opened by a businessman named David Cook. The idea was almost stupidly simple. In an era when renting a movie meant a cramped, sticky corner shop with a thin, random selection, Blockbuster offered something that felt like the future: a bright, clean, family-friendly superstore. Thousands of tapes on the shelves, open late, with a computerized checkout system that could tell you exactly what was in stock. It was the Walmart of the video store, and it arrived at the exact moment America fell in love with the VCR. But the man who really turned Blockbuster into a monster wasn't its founder. In 1987, an investor named Wayne Huizenga bought in. And Huizenga was no ordinary businessman. He had already built the garbage-hauling giant Waste Management from a single truck into a national empire. He looked at these video stores and saw the same thing he'd seen in trash: a boring business that threw off enormous, steady cash that could be scaled up faster than anyone imagined. So he did it again. The growth was explosive. Blockbuster wasn't opening stores. It was carpet-bombing the country with them. By the early 90s, it was opening a new store. On average, every 17 hours. It swallowed competitors whole, buying up regional chains and flipping them blue and gold. By 1994, Huizenga had grown the chain to around 3,600 locations, pulling in some $4 billion a year. The famous ticket stub logo went up in strip malls from California to Maine, and that success attracted a very big buyer. In 1994, media titan Sumner Redstone and his company Viacom bought Blockbuster in a complicated deal worth $8.4 billion, betting that the video rental cash machine would keep printing money for decades. Remember that number, $8.4 billion. It's the peak of the mountain. Keep it in mind, because you're going to hear what the whole thing eventually sold for at the bottom, and the distance between those two numbers is the entire story. The numbers got staggering. At its peak in 2004, Blockbuster operated more than 9,000 stores worldwide and employed around 84,000 people. More than 40 million households in the United States alone carried a Blockbuster membership card. The company was valued at roughly $5 billion. Friday night in America had a ritual, and that ritual had a name: a trip to Blockbuster, walking the aisles, arguing over what to watch, grabbing a bag of popcorn and some candy at the counter on the way out. But here is the first clue on the table, the detail the corner circles in red. A huge share of Blockbuster's profit didn't come from renting you the movie. It came from you being late, bringing it back. Late fees. By some estimates, in its best years, those late fees generated somewhere around $800 million, close to a sixth of the company's entire revenue. Think about what that means. One of the most profitable parts of the business model was built on annoying its own customers. On the frustration of a $5 rental turning into a $20 penalty because you forgot to drop the tape in the box. Blockbuster wasn't just selling entertainment. It was quietly taxing forgetfulness. And for years, that tax made them rich. It also made them a company that its own customers had a very good reason to resent: a crack in the foundation nobody at the top could see, because the money was too good. And there's a second warning sign the coroner notes here. Even Blockbuster's own owner was quietly losing faith. In 2004, Viacom decided the video rental business was no longer the golden goose it had paid $8.4 billion for, and it cut Blockbuster loose, spinning it off as a separate, standalone company and walking away. The The parent that had bet the house on Blockbuster a decade earlier was now getting out. From the outside, everything still looked enormous and healthy. But the smart money at the very top was already heading for the exits. Before we open this one up any further, subscribe and hit the bell. Because on this channel, no fortune is too big to end up on the table. And trust me, the cause of death here is never the one you'd guess. Because in 1997, 2,000 miles away, in California, that resentment was about to be turned into a weapon. Two men named Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph had started a tiny company with a strange idea, mailing DVDs to people's homes, in little red envelopes. No stores, no shelves. And this is the part that mattered: no late fees. For the first couple of years, Netflix was small, fragile, and burning through cash. Its whole model sounded almost too simple to matter. You picked movies on a website. They arrived in your mailbox in a red envelope. You watched them. You mailed them back, and you kept them as long as you wanted. No due dates, no late fees, no driving to a store on a rainy Tuesday to return a tape. Everything Blockbuster made you tolerate, Netflix quietly removed. But wanting a thing and surviving long enough to build it are two different things. The dot-com crash had just wiped out fortunes across the internet. Investors had stopped funding money-losing websites overnight, and Netflix was bleeding cash with no clear path to profit. It was, in the year 2000, exactly the kind of company that dies quietly and is forgotten. So its founders did the sensible thing. They went looking for a lifeboat. And the biggest, most obvious lifeboat in the entire industry was Blockbuster. So, in the year 2000, they got on a plane to Dallas to make a deal. The pitch was simple: let Blockbuster buy Netflix, run the online side, and use it to sell the powerful Blockbuster brand on the web. The price they were asking was $50 million. As Mark Randolph would later tell it, they sat in a conference room across from Blockbuster's leadership, including then CEO John Antioco, and made their case. And the response, in Randolph's words, was that they were laughed out of the room. To the executives running a $5 billion giant, the idea of paying $50 million for a money-losing website that mailed out DVDs seemed almost like a joke. And here is the thing you have to be fair about. On paper, in the year 2000, it was not an insane decision. Netflix was tiny. Blockbuster was everywhere. Broadband internet was slow and rare. Streaming a movie was science fiction. Turning down a struggling startup for $50 million was the kind of sensible, responsible call that a well-run company makes all the time. That is exactly what makes this an autopsy, and not a horror story. The knife that killed Blockbuster wasn't stupidity. It was reasonableness, applied at exactly the wrong moment. Because someone inside Blockbuster did see it coming. That same CEO who was in the room, John Antioco, spent the next few years watching Netflix grow, and he understood the threat better than almost anyone gives him credit for. By the mid-2000s, Antioco was pushing Blockbuster to reinvent itself. In 2004, the company launched Blockbuster Online to fight Netflix directly in the mail-order DVD business. Then came the bigger, bolder move. In 2005, Antioco did something close to heresy. He moved to kill the late fee. The very thing that customers hated most, the $800 million tax on forgetfulness, he wanted gone. Because he knew it was driving people straight into Netflix's arms. Then in 2006, he rolled out the Masterstroke, a program called Total Access. The idea was brilliant. Netflix could mail you a DVD, but Netflix didn't have 9,000 stores. Total Access let customers rent online and then return and swap their movies in a physical Blockbuster store, instantly, for free. It fused the two things Netflix could never combine: the convenience of mail and the immediacy of a store on your corner. And it worked. Customers loved it. Blockbuster started adding online subscribers faster than Netflix itself. For one brief, remarkable moment, the giant had figured it out. Blockbuster was winning. So, quick question. While the body's still on the table, right here, 2006. 2007, Blockbuster is beating Netflix at its own game. If you were running this company, with the momentum finally on your side, what would you have done next? Hold that thought, drop your answer in the comments. Because what happens next is the part almost nobody predicted. It's the reason this whole thing came crashing down. And it didn't come from Netflix at all. It came from inside the boardroom. Total Access was working, but it was expensive. Eliminating late fees had cost the company an estimated $400 million. Building the online service and subsidizing all those free in-store swaps cost hundreds of millions more. By some accounts, Every free movie handed over the counter cost Blockbuster around $2. Antioco was making a bet. Spend big now. Lose money now. To strangle Netflix before it got too strong. It's the same bet Netflix itself was making. It's the same bet Amazon made for years. Bleed today to own tomorrow. But Blockbuster had something Netflix didn't. An activist investor named Carl Icahn. Icahn had bought a large stake in the company, and in 2005, he waged a proxy fight and won himself seats on the board. He clashed with Antioco famously over Antioco's pay. In 2004, Antioco had received a compensation package reported at around $51 million, and Icahn was furious about it. The two went to war, and as that war escalated, the board turned against Antioco's expensive strategy. They looked at the money pouring out the door to fund total access and free returns, and they wanted it to stop. They wanted profit. Now, in 2007, after a dispute over his bonus, John Antioco walked out the door, and his growth strategy walked out with him. To replace him, the board brought in a new CEO named Jim Keyes, a retail veteran who had run the convenience store chain 7-Eleven. And Keyes saw the world very differently. Where Antioco saw a technology company that needed to outspend a rival to survive, Keyes saw a retailer with too many costs and not enough profit. So he reversed course. The spending on total access was pulled back, and the terms were made less generous. Prices went up. The focus swung away from the desperate war with Netflix and back towards squeezing the stores. And in what would become the most quoted line of the entire story, Keyes said, publicly, in 2008, neither Redbox nor Netflix are even on the radar screen in terms of competition. Netflix. Competition, not on the radar, said out loud by the CEO 2 years before bankruptcy. The results were exactly what you'd fear. Blockbuster's online growth stalled and reversed. Netflix, given room to breathe, kept climbing. And then, the ground itself began to move. In 2007, Netflix launched streaming movies delivered instantly over the internet. No disc, no mailbox, no store at all. The very science fiction that had seemed impossible in that Dallas conference room was now real. And think about the timing, because it's almost cruel. Just 1 year earlier, Blockbuster had been ahead. It had the brand, it had the stores, it had the momentum, and it had a CEO who understood that the future was online. If it had held its nerve and kept investing, Blockbuster is the company that could have built streaming first. Imagine it, a Blockbuster button on every television in America. Instead, at the exact moment the industry tipped into the future, Blockbuster had just spent its momentum, drained its cash, and fired the one man betting on that future. It didn't just lose the race, it handed its rival the finish line, gift-wrapped. Netflix took the opening and never looked back, and Blockbuster had no answer for any of it. After that, the numbers only moved one direction, down. The debt Blockbuster had taken on over the years, well over $900 million of it became an anchor. Every closed store, every lost subscriber, every quarter of falling revenue pulled it deeper. The company that once opened a store every 17 hours now started closing them by the thousands. In a final, almost tragic irony, in 2010 Blockbuster brought the late fee back, quietly renaming it additional daily rates. The one decision Antioco had bet the company on reversing, they undid. They returned to taxing the very customers they had left. And behind those numbers were people. At its height, Blockbuster had employed around 84,000 of them store clerks who knew their regulars by name, managers who'd given the company a decade of Friday nights. As the stores closed by the thousands, those jobs vanished with them, quietly, register by register, in strip malls all over the country. The empire didn't die in one loud explosion. It died in 10,000 small closings, each one a set of keys turned in a lock for the last time. It wasn't enough. On September 23, 2010, Blockbuster filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, buried under roughly $900 million in debt. A company once worth $5 billion bought, once, for $8.4 billion was, functionally, worth nothing. In 2011, its remains were sold at auction to the satellite provider Dish Network for around $320 million. Sit with those two numbers for a second. $8.4 billion at the top of the mountain, $320 million at the bottom. That is the full width of the fall, and nearly all of it happened in a single decade. The stores went dark, city by city. Thousands of blue and gold signs switched off for the last time. Today, Exactly one Blockbuster store remains open. In Bend, Oregon, a single survivor, kept alive as a nostalgia stop, a museum of a world that used to be. The startup they laughed at in that Dallas conference room streams to hundreds of millions of homes and is worth more than 1,000 times the $50 million Blockbuster wouldn't pay. So what actually killed Blockbuster? It's tempting to say Netflix or the internet. But look at the body on the table. Blockbuster saw the threat. Blockbuster built the answer. Total access nearly worked. The fatal wound wasn't blindness. It was that, at the exact moment it needed to keep spending to win the future, it chose short-term profit instead. It fired the man who saw tomorrow, to please the men who wanted money today. It had the cure in its hand and put it down. Cause of death, not disruption. Impatience. A $5 billion company that could survive the internet, but could not survive one boardroom's need to make the numbers look good for one more quarter. The fortune's on the table. The report is written. So whose empire should we autopsy next? Tell us in the comments. And if you made it this far, you already know the rule of this channel. No fortune is ever too big to die. Subscribe, and we'll see you at the next autopsy.